My name's Jessica Miller, I'm 29, and I can still feel the sting of my mother's words the way a fresh bruise throbs under the skin, tender, unseen, and impossible to ignore. It was a Sunday morning in late March, the kind of morning when sunlight filters through the blinds just enough to make everything look softer than it really is. My mother, Linda, stood in the kitchen in her pressed navy robe, the scent of black coffee cutting through the stillness like authority itself. I had just told her I'd turned down a steady office job at a marketing firm to start my own photography business. My dream, and the silence that followed was so sharp I could almost hear it hum. Then came her laugh, low, clipped, almost pitying. Photography, she repeated, setting her mug down with a tap that sounded final. Jessica, that's not a career. That's a hobby for people who don't want to grow up. The words landed like slaps, one after another. I remember trying to smile. I even managed a weak one, because that's what I'd learned to do in front of her. Smile, even when it burns. It's not a hobby, Mom, I said quietly. I already have clients, small brands, but it's something. I'm building. Building what? She interrupted, turning toward me with that familiar expression. Half disbelief, half disappointment. A dream? Dreams don't pay bills. They don't pay rent. They don't buy insurance. You need something real, Jessica. I wanted to tell her that this was real, that I had been working 18-hour days for months, learning lighting, editing, branding, all of it, that I'd saved enough money to buy my first professional camera, that when I took photos I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. But I knew how that would sound to her, naive. My mother had always lived by rules that belonged to another generation. She believed in ladders, corporate ones. She climbed hers with the precision of a soldier, sacrificing weekends, friends, and eventually happiness. For almost 20 years, she'd worked at Rivers & Cole, a luxury fashion house that thrived on image and exclusivity. She wore that name like armor. It made her feel significant, invincible, until the day it didn't. When they let her go during a corporate downsizing, she didn't just lose her job, she lost her identity. She came home that evening with a box of framed certificates and a silence that lasted weeks. She never talked about it, but it changed her. It made her colder. She saw the world as a place that punished idealists and rewarded obedience. And now she looked at me, her only child, as if I were walking straight into the fire she'd barely escaped. So when she said, "Mark my words, you'll regret not having something real," it wasn't just disapproval. It was projection, her own failure echoing through my choices, but understanding that didn't soften the blow. It only made it hurt differently. I can still picture the morning light reflecting off her coffee mug, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. I remember how her tone shifted, lower, almost maternal for a moment, when she added, "I'm just trying to protect you, Jessica. The world doesn't care about passion, it cares about profit." She meant it as advice, but to me it sounded like surrender. That was the moment something shifted inside me. It wasn't rebellion, not at first. It was grief. Grief for the relationship we could have had if she'd ever believed in me. Grief for the part of me that still craved her approval more than success itself. I left the kitchen quietly, holding back the tears until I reached my room. My camera sat on the desk, a second-hand Canon with a cracked lens cover, but when I picked it up, it felt like a lifeline. I turned it over in my hands and thought, this is real to me. I remember standing by the window, looking out at the gray skyline of Portland, thinking how strange it was that the woman who taught me to be independent now hated the way I expressed it. I wanted her pride, but all she gave me was doubt, and somehow, that doubt became the spark I needed. From that day, every time I woke up at 5 to edit photos or pitch to clients who barely took me seriously, her voice echoed in my head. Every rejection, every failure, every empty bank account, I carried her disbelief like fuel. She thought I was chasing something frivolous, but I was building a world from light, color, and persistence. And yet, behind all the drive and determination, there was always that wound, the one her words had carved. Because when your own mother tells you your dream is worthless, no amount of ambition can erase the ache completely. It's strange looking back now how humiliation can evolve into momentum. How something that once crippled you can later propel you further than you ever thought possible. But back then, I didn't know that. I only knew that I had to prove her wrong, not out of anger, but because I needed to believe that she was wrong. That morning in our kitchen marked the quiet beginning of everything that came after. I just didn't realize yet that her bitterness, the very thing that broke me, would one day become the foundation of my strength. and that the company she'd once served, the one that had discarded her like a spent resource, would eventually fall into my hands. But that's another part of the story. For now, all I remember is the taste of cold coffee, the sound of her certainty, and the unshakable resolve forming in my chest as I promised myself, I'll make this real. You'll see. The first 2 years were brutal in ways that don't photograph well. Hard work has a face, but it isn't cinematic. It's puffy eyes at 3:17 a.m., hands cramped into claws from retouching skin and fabric for hours, Raymond steam fogging a second-hand monitor, and a floor that creaks because you can't afford to fix the loose board under the folding table you dared to call a desk. Luma Studio was a business by optimism and paperwork. In reality, it was a studio apartment with blackout curtains and gaffer tape on everything I owned. I hustled for anything that carried a check. Baby portraits under ceiling fans that hummed louder than the parents' weddings where drunk uncles insisted on just one more shot. Local festivals where I balanced on milk crates to capture a mayor cutting a ribbon with scissors too big for his hands. I said yes to charity events that promised great exposure, and learned that exposure does not pay vendors, landlords, or taxes. I learned QuickBooks at midnight and color theory at dawn. I learned the dangerous patience of buffering wheels and how to whisper to Lightroom so it wouldn't crash before I saved the catalog. The days had a rhythm that would have looked like discipline from the outside and felt like survival from the inside. Mornings, invoices, cold pitch emails, and polite rejections that read like "Heiku, we'll pass, best of luck." Afternoons, shoots in improvised studios, living rooms cleared of toys, storefronts swept for dust, back alleys with good brick texture if you used a 50mm wide open and pretended the dumpster didn't exist. Evenings blurred into night, culling, batch edits, individual masking, frequency separation on a bride's cheek, a dog's leash cloned out, a marquee letter leveled into submission, and always my mother's commentary drifting in from another tab, her Facebook posts about kids these days, about the sanctity of real jobs, the subtle sermonizing aimed at me without ever saying my name. I told myself not to look. I always looked. I built a pricing sheet, then rebuilt it 3 times when I learned that friends and family discount meant the opposite of profit. I read contracts until phrases like work for hire and perpetual license stalked my dreams. I bought insurance after a toddler tripped over a light stand and the room inhaled as one. I learned to take chords, to say head up, gaze down, to keep granola bars in my bag for fainting bridesmaids. I learned that creative direction is 90% psychology. Make your subject feel safe, and the lens will tell the truth you need. Gear was a negotiation with reality. My camera was secondhand, its shutter count a confession. My lenses were either rented or found in the strange economy of photography forums. Every purchase required a spreadsheet, 3 cups of coffee, and a pep talk. When I finally bought a used strobe, I treated it like a newborn. When I couldn't afford a backdrop, I ironed a thrifted bedsheet and made the wrinkle pattern a feature. When natural light failed, I learned to sculpt with a single softbox and a reflector made from foam insulation wrapped in aluminum tape. Clients trickled in, then trickled out, and I tracked each inquiry on a color-coded board made from sticky notes that lost their adhesion in August heat. Some jobs felt like miracles. A baker whose croissants I lit like architecture, a florist who cried when I sent her gallery because the roses looked exactly like they smelled. Other jobs felt like slow humiliation. A boutique owner who tried to pay me in store credit and exposure. A startup that ghosted after 5 rounds of revisions. A groom who said my rate was offensive because you just press a button. I learned to write scopes, to set payment schedules, to say no without apology. It took months to realize that boundaries were part of craft. Marketing was another battlefield. I taught myself to speak in captions that didn't sound like begging. Concise, honest, visually led. I posted daily for a year, carousels with art direction notes, behind-the-scenes snippets, micro-tutorials on color grading. I tracked the numbers like I was counting rosary beads, saves, shares, reach, conversion. I found a voice that felt like mine, minimalist, clean, precise emotion. It wasn't about perfection, it was about intention. The loneliness surprised me. Creativity is communal in theory and solitary in practice. I missed having colleagues to celebrate small wins or laugh off the nonsense. My team was a timer, a playlist, and the coffee maker. On the worst nights, I would open my mother's profile, read her status about ambition, and feel both fury and hunger. She wasn't wrong that bills demanded obedience. She was wrong that only one kind of work deserved to be called real. There were anchoring moments, little proofs that effort accumulates. A local magazine ran a 4-page spread of my images for a story on women-owned businesses. A nonprofit commissioned portraits that later landed on a billboard, and I almost drove off the road when I saw them, giant and undeniable, my name in small letters at the bottom right. A shop owner told me sales rose after we replaced her yellow-tinted product photos with crisp, shadow-kissed angles. I started keeping a folder called Credibility on my desktop, filled with screenshots of kind emails and little victories to re-raid when the bank balance whispered panic. Then Allura Threads reached out, a small fashion label with the right kind of hunger in its language. The founder, Maya Collins, wrote a brief that looked like a poem: quiet confidence, natural fibers, skin like morning light, clothes that move like thought. She'd seen my work on Instagram, a series I'd done with white linen against raw plaster. She wanted me to build a campaign around 4 pieces: a slip dress, a wrap blouse, a wide-legged trouser, and a jacket hand-dyed with indigo. The budget wasn't extravagant, but it was honest and included usage that respected the images. I asked for 2 days of pre-pro for mood boards and casting. She said yes without flinching. It felt like stepping onto a set where everyone had read the same script. I built a palette from silence, matte whites, bleached oak, soft shadow. I scouted a location with north-facing windows and a concrete floor that would bounce light like a whisper. I cast a model whose freckles felt like punctuation, and a second whose gaze could hold an entire paragraph without blinking. On the test day, I taped a paper grid to the wall and experimented with one strobe at quarter power, feathered until the fabric read like breath. We kept the styling ruthless. No jewelry, bare nails, hair brushed but unfinished. Every frame had to say essential. Shoot day unfurled with rare grace. Maya moved like a conductor, present, curious, never intrusive. We shot in sequences: stillness, motion, stillness again, so the clothes could speak in both registers. At noon the sun slicked across the concrete and I chased a flare I'd usually avoid, letting it wash the model's shoulder in a strip of gold that made the indigo sing. We taped the hem of the trousers to catch a line the wind refused to give us. We used a door as a flag. We turned a packing blanket into texture. When we wrapped, nobody applauded. We just exhaled in a room that felt suddenly larger than it was. I posted a single image 2 days later: the slip dress in profile, the model's collarbone a clean arc, light skimming fabric so gently it seemed to hesitate. The caption read, "Clothes that remember the body after it leaves." It wasn't clever, it was true. The response was immediate, then exponential. Shares doubled, then tripled. A stylist with 1 million followers reposted the carousel and called it honest clothing. A mid-tier editor DM'd to ask about credits. Maya's site traffic spiked. She sold through 2 sizes in 12 hours. My inbox turned into weather, a storm front of inquiries, collaboration requests, questions about rates and availability. The word waitlist entered my vocabulary with a thrill that felt illegal. Growth is noisy: new inquiries, new folders, new checklists. I stopped editing at the kitchen counter and bought a real desk someone else had assembled. I hired an assistant, Ava, who organized chaos like she'd been born inside a calendar. She built a CRM from color-coded air. I contracted a retoucher for heavy-lift projects, then a part-time producer who could do the unglamorous miracles: permits, parking, snacks nobody is allergic to. I said we without flinching and meant it. Then came the decision that scared me more than any invoice. I brought on a creative director, Noah Reed, a former agency art lead who left because the deck-to-reality pipeline bored him. He understood my aesthetic and pushed it forward, not wider. More restraint, he'd say, turning down a prop with 2 fingers like it was radioactive. He made me ruthless about sequence, about the story a campaign tells when you scroll in silence. With Noah shaping the arc and Ava holding the bones, Luma Studio began to look like the place I had seen in my head when I was ironing bedsheets for backdrops. But velocity has its shadows. Every success threatened to flatten the memory of how I got here, and I refused to let it. I kept the folding table against the wall in the new space as a reminder that nothing about this was inevitable. I kept the credibility folder updated, not to preen but to inoculate against the days when doubt returned wearing a new suit. I kept a handwritten list taped above my monitor: light, line, honesty. When emails demanded shortcuts, I read the list aloud. And yet, even with the momentum, the wound my mother opened never fully closed. It simply knitted around a stronger muscle. On certain nights, when the studio went quiet and the screens finally dimmed, I would still hear her voice and feel the urge to prove, to testify, to make every pixel a rebuttal. I didn't hate her for it anymore. I understood the fear beneath her words, a fear of becoming invisible. Allura threads led to 3 more fashion clients, then 6. My calendar became a landscape of holds, options, and production meetings. My rate stopped apologizing for itself. The girl my mom had called a dreamer now negotiated deliverables with legal departments and asked for overtime in writing. I learned to say, "That's out of scope," and to smile when silence followed. I learned to leave money on the table when the brief wanted my name but not my high. One evening, deep in a run of back-to-back shoots, I stayed late to rename files with the tidy precision of someone who knows chaos is expensive. The city was a grid of orange outside the windows. Ava had gone home, Noah had texted a reference from a book I didn't know yet, and the strobe heads cooled with the sound of sighing. I poured bad coffee into a clean cup and opened my email to clear the last few messages before sleep. That's when I saw the subject line that threaded past and future together with a single name I knew too well. Rivers and Cole. 3 years can be both a lifetime and a blink. When the call came from Ethan, an investor friend who always sounded like he was narrating a market crash and a sunrise at once, I was in the studio, reviewing a lookbook sequence with my team. "Hey Jess," he said, voice clipped, purposeful. "Remember Rivers and Cole? They're struggling, bad management, dated marketing, 0 digital presence. Their board is looking to sell." The name burned like a flare in a dark room. Rivers and Cole, my mother's former cathedral, the brand that had conferred meaning on her business card and then ripped it away. That company was architecture in her mind. Marble lobbies, swan-necked brass fixtures, loyalty as currency. Hearing they were weak felt like seeing a skyscraper with a cracked foundation. "I'll think about it," I told him, careful to keep my voice neutral. I hung up and stared at the mood board on the wall. Pared down palettes, clean typography, fabric moving like truth. My chest tightened. My mother's voice, "Photography isn't a career," surfaced with clinical precision. I slept in shards that night, replaying the kitchen, the coffee mug, the humiliation that had once immolated me and then slowly forged steel. By morning, the fog had burned off into clarity. I gathered the team. "We're buying them," I said. No drama in the words, only decision. There was a pause, and then the room became a system. Ava flagging diligence tasks on a fresh board, Noah asking for access to archives, finance outlining a timetable like a grid. The next months were a study in disciplined curiosity. We built a due diligence war room, digital folders labeled with the ruthless accuracy of an operating theater. Financials, 3 years of P and Ls, balance sheets swollen with obsolete inventory, a cash flow statement that wheezed in Q3. Operations, a supply chain map littered with bottlenecks, vendor relationships starved of attention, aging ERP systems that crashed when asked to do anything ambitious. Brand, a logo that looked expensive in 2009 and timid now, a website optimized for desktop users who no longer existed, social media feeds that reposted press mentions like victory laps around a shrinking track. We talked to department heads off the record. The creative team used words like safe and proven as if they were medals. Merchandising blamed marketing, marketing blamed product. Leadership blamed the market. I took notes without judgment and then underlined the pattern in red. No one believed the future was theirs to make. Valuation became an exercise in separating decay from potential. Ethan's team modeled scenarios across 3 lanes: liquidation value, maintain and hope, transform and scale. The board's asking price reflected ego and nostalgia. We countered with a number that assumed pain, investment, and patience. I proposed a structure with an earnout tied to digital performance. If we were right about the potential, they'd still taste upside. If we were wrong, we wouldn't drown in debt. It was more than a purchase. It was a thesis that creativity, operational discipline, and honest storytelling could turn a sleeping brand into a modern one. While lawyers laced term sheets with protective language, I conducted a silent brand autopsy. I pulled every campaign image from the last decade and pinned them in a long chronological ribbon across the studio wall. You could see the confidence leach out of the photography year by year. The models smiled more as the brand lost nerve, as if pleasantness could compensate for lost identity. Light flattened, poses became catalog sincere, color saturation rose like a fever. They got louder when they got scared, Noah observed. He was right, fear screams, conviction whispers. We built a counter strategy. We would subtract. Fewer SKUs, more substance. Elevated essentials, not trend chasing. Fabric that photographed like a promise and more like proof. We drafted a creative doctrine on a single page. Light over spectacle. Honesty over adornment. Texture as story. Women as subjects, not props. I commissioned an audit of customer sentiment that didn't ask, "Do you like our brand?" But "What do you wear on days that matter?" The answers skewed toward quiet power. Clothes that don't announce, they convince. Rivers and Cole had once owned that space. The gap was cultural, not just aesthetic. The board negotiations were theater with spreadsheets. Their chair, a man with silver hair and the patience of a chess player, insisted the brand's name carried intrinsic value. I agreed, then showed the trend line: declining unaided awareness, rising negative feedback on fit, a digital share of voice graph that looked like a slow fade. Names hold value, I said, but value can be squandered. Our offer stood. We were buying a story that needed to be rewritten, not a crown to place on our heads. Financing came as a braid, a debt facility at a rate that forced discipline, a slice of private capital with a growth clause, and a modest cash component. I put a painful amount of retained earnings from Luma on the line. The risk felt surgical. I slept on the decision 2 nights and woke with the same answer both mornings. We do this or we regret not doing it. Integration planning began before signatures dried. We mapped systems, their clunky CMS to be replaced with a nimble stack, their asset pipeline rebuilt so every image had a known home, usage rights, and life cycle. Their in-house studio reimagined as a place where design, copy, and light sat within arm's reach. We sketched a phased rebrand. Silent housekeeping first, fit, quality assurance, fulfillment speed, then visible signals, identity, site, campaigns, then a public statement not in words but in work. The day the deal closed, the notification flashed on my phone like a drumbeat. Luma Studio acquires Rivers and Cole. There was no champagne. There was a checklist. We convened a town hall in their headquarters, high ceilings, tired furniture, a lobby that still smelled like money. I wore black and stood in front of a staff that looked equal parts wary and hungry. "I'm not here to paste a fresh logo over old problems," I said, voice steady. "We will fix what customers feel before we brag about it. We will simplify to strengthen. We will make images that tell the truth about the clothes and clothes that can stand next to those images without apology." There were no whoops, no performative claps, just pens moving, eyes lifting, a collective inhalation. That was better than applause. It was consent to try. Back at Luma, we built the rebrand sprint. Noah led concept. Ava built critical paths that intimidated even the printers. I owned narrative, how to explain a resurrection without sounding like a confession. We wrote the brief for a creative head of Rivers and Cole with precision. A leader fluent in restraint, allergic to gimmicks, able to earn the respect of teams bruised by years of hedging. We posted the role publicly. I insisted on it. If we claimed honesty, we needed a transparent search. The portfolio review rubric was a scalpel: cohesion, light discipline, restraint under pressure, evidence of leading a team through change. Applications arrived in floods. Agency veterans with glossy decks, indie art directors with flashes of clarity and uneven craft, fashion photographers hinting at curiosity but not at leadership. We filtered, debated, found 2 Mabes and 1 probable. Then a new application pinged my inbox, a name I knew before I read the subject line, a resume built over 20 years and broken by 1 layoff, a cover letter that was uncharacteristically brief and perfectly spelled. From Linda Miller. Subject: application, creative head, Rivers and Cole. I hovered over the file, heart steady, breath not. The document waited, heavy and motionless, like a sealed room you can enter but only once. She arrived 10 minutes early, the way she always had for anything that mattered. The receptionist pinged me. I watched her on the security monitor crossing the lobby I'd repainted in a palette of soft whites and oak, spaces that asked you to breathe before you spoke. Her steps were careful, measured, toes pointing slightly inward as if she were bracing for the floor to tilt. The resume was clutched in her manicured hands like a passport at a border. When my door opened, a memory opened with it: the kitchen, the coffee mug, the sentence that had squared my spine for years. But the woman in my office now was not the lecturer from that morning. She looked older, smaller, somehow, as if the time between then and now had collapsed some scaffolding only she could feel. Still, her voice came trimmed and neat. "Jessica," she said softly but not weakly, "I didn't realize this was your company." I gestured toward the chair opposite my desk. "It's our company now," I replied, and heard my own care in the phrasing. "I did not mean yours and mine. I meant ours as in all the people who kept the place humming. The producer who knew how to get permits through broken municipal systems, the junior retoucher who could uncrease a shirt without flattening its character, the studio manager who set out fruit and granola like a quiet promise each morning. I meant the plural I had built. But I left the ambiguity where it was. Some bridges need ambiguity like oil." She sat. The resume, crisp and cream, stayed in her hands. She didn't push it forward. She looked around my office instead, at the framed test press from our first capsule lookbook, at the cork wall pinned with contact sheets annotated in pencil, at the small dish of safety pins and binder clips my team joked was my kit of last resort. Her eyes moved like a reconnaissance mission. I waited. "It's been hard," she said finally. No preamble, no strategy. The market turned cold. People want younger ideas at lower salaries, or they want a fresh voice and then tell you what to say. She exhaled through her nose. "I miss feeling valuable." No arrogance this time, just exhaustion shaped into a sentence. She let the word valuable rest on the table between us. It had always been her currency. Titles were proof, not just of competence, but of existence. When Rivers and Cole released her, they hadn't just cut a position, they'd unstitched an identity. Hearing her say it out loud without armor shifted something I didn't expect to move. We talked. Not like adversaries, like two people who knew where the other kept her fragile things. She asked precise questions about the acquisition, the financial runway, the integration pace. I answered plainly, forcing myself not to perform competence, just to demonstrate it. She nodded when I spoke about inventory rationalization and fit reform, about how brand honesty starts at the seam and only then becomes a photograph. She didn't flinch at the phrase "under my leadership." She just absorbed it, as if it were weather. Part of me wanted to lash out, wanted the old speech, polished over years of imaginary rehearsals. "Now you see. My career isn't a joke. Ladders aren't the only way up." But the words melted when I looked at her, not a villain, not a cautionary tale, but a woman who had tethered her worth to a cardstock rectangle and watched the tether snap. I recognized the hunger to matter. We had always shared it, we had just cooked it differently. So I hired her. Not as an executive, I didn't hand her a rank like a bouquet, but as a consultant, scoped to the work and reporting to me. A clean contract, measurable deliverables, 90 days. The paperwork took 20 minutes, the psychic paperwork, longer. The first weeks were awkward in the way freshly painted walls smell, present, not poisonous. In meetings, she sat one chair farther from me than she had to, lining her pen with the notebook spine as if aligning herself with a grid nobody else could see. When I asked for input, she offered it carefully, often prefacing with "this may be obvious," as if safeguarding against her ideas being dismissed as either passé or presumptuous. She avoided my eyes. I let the avoidance stand. Forcing intimacy is just another kind of violence. I introduced her to the team with language I crafted as deliberately as a color grade. Linda brings deep institutional knowledge of the legacy brand and a keen sense for structure. She's here to help us build better processes around fit, assortment, and post-production workflow. She'll be supporting creative, not steering it. The verbs mattered. People hear verbs more than titles. She started with the unglamorous. She audited the sample closet and built a tagging system that made Ava weep with gratitude: season, fit notes, defect flags, ownership. She shadowed a fitting and captured micro-adjustments in a chart that prevented 2 days of reshoots later. She mapped our image life cycle from capture to archive and found 8 places where time leaked out like a cracked pipe. She proposed fixes that were procedural, not punitive. Templated file naming conventions, locked folders for selects, a pre-published checklist that caught almosts before they hit the grid. It wasn't genius. It was discipline, and discipline is how genius keeps its promises. Still, friction, quiet, not sharp, surfaced. The language of her past sometimes knocked against the air of our present. She said on brand when we said in intention. She asked about hero shots like they were a genre instead of a mood. Noah bristled once and then caught himself, smoothing the room with a plain, let's define the aim. Afterward, I thanked him. Hierarchy isn't the culture, I said, but neither is amnesia. The eye contact came first in the studio. During a test day, we were shooting a double-page feel for knit tees. One model static, one moving. The single light I'd feathered wasn't giving the fabric its volume. I was tweaking angles a millimeter at a time, feeling that itchy edge between craft and control. She stepped close, not interfering, simply present, and said, "Your edge light's honest, but you're letting the key do too much narrative." She had always been good at naming rooms. I looked up. There it was, eye to eye, not challenge but recognition. I added a bounce, pulled the key back half a stop. The fabric breathed. We didn't high-five, we worked. She learned our shorthand with speed that startled the juniors. We say take the air out when we mean simplify, I told her. She translated it into a checklist. Kill the extra prop, remove the stray strand, compress the palette by one. She learned to read Noah's silences. When his head tilted, it meant the story is drifting. She learned that I revised in layers, structure first, polish last. She learned Ava's scheduling witchcraft and stopped asking for meetings that didn't have tables under them. At her desk, temporary by choice, she kept her bag tucked exactly under the chair as if she might need to leave quickly. She ate lunch with the production coordinator 2 days in a row and laughed at something I couldn't hear from my office. She asked the junior photographer to teach her a batch script. She took notes. She made a point of complimenting a good cut, not a good outfit. These are small things. Small things are where culture lives. We had our first difficult conversation in week 3. She had reworked a process doc with an elegance I admired and a rigidity I didn't. This locks us in, I said, sliding the pages back. We need a rule that behaves like a guideline. She took a breath, then another. I watched the old reflexes. Defend, polish, persuade, rise and settle. Tell me which step feels like a door when you want a hinge, she said. I marked 2 sections with a pencil. We rewrote them together. It took 20 minutes. It repaired 10 years. One evening, I found her in the studio after everyone left, standing in the cone of light a single strobe makes when it faces the wall. The space was quiet in the sacred way. C-stands like prayer sticks, cables coiled with intention, the faint warmth of gear cooling on metal. She traced the edge of the shadow with a fingertip, almost amused. You always liked soft light, she said without turning. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even nostalgia. It was acknowledgement that aesthetic is biography. We photograph what we yearn for. We began to inhabit the same sentences. In a cross-team stand-up, she said, let's let the fabric carry the sentence and the model carry the clause. And half the room scribbled it down. In an asset review, she pushed for removing 3 frames that were technically perfect and emotionally redundant. Good photographs can be bad edits, she said. Noah nodded. I closed the set. She didn't glow with the victory of being right. She exhaled with the relief of belonging. The apology, when it came, arrived without theater. It was late, a night of relabeling files and grid-testing typography wits. Everyone else gone, the city outside drawn in sodium lines. I was at my desk with a mug of water gone warm. She hovered in the doorway, not wanting to spook whatever calm I had finally cultivated. I was wrong, Jessica, she said. No build-up, no clause to manage the impact. About what I said back then, you built something extraordinary. The word extraordinary has edges. It can slice if you don't handle it. In her mouth, it had weight instead. It didn't try to erase the past. It didn't ask for absolution. It just described the room we were standing in, the work on the walls, the people who would fill the space in the morning, the system of intention threaded through every checklist and light diagram. I looked at her and felt something I had not let myself feel. Not victory. Not vindication. Relief. The kind that loosens a muscle you didn't know you'd clenched for a decade. When she left that night, I stayed. I sat alone in the soft glow of the monitors, listening to the building's quiet mechanics, then I cried again, for different reasons. Not because I had proved her wrong, but because I no longer needed to. Because the sentence she'd once used to diminish me had been rewritten by rooms like this, by days like these, by a team that breathed in rhythm. Because forgiveness, I discovered, is not a favor you grant to the person who hurt you. It is a form of precision. You align the truth, and the image finally resolves. A year can be a unit of time or a unit of proof. In 12 months, Rivers and Cole, long treated like a family relic, stopped being the echo of a better era and started speaking in a contemporary voice that didn't beg for attention so much as command it by refusing to shout. The numbers formed a kind of testimony. Our first full relaunch capsule sold through 82% in 9 days with a return rate under 5%, an anomaly for apparel unless the fit is honest. Email open rates doubled, then held. Returns to exchange ratios suggested customers wanted to stay in the brand's world, even when a size missed. Site dwell time climbed with each campaign, not because we trapped people in a funnel, but because the images didn't lie, and the copy didn't explain what the images already said. Influencers, real ones whose recommendations are relationships, not transactions, started referencing Luma Studio when they talked about Rivers and Cole. They used words like considered, restraint, real. Stylists messaged to ask about fabric testing, and left conversations talking about light direction. You know a brand is breathing again when people ask process questions instead of price questions. We broke 2 industry benchmarks on a platform that had treated fashion as a carousel of sameness. The algorithm did what algorithms do when fed coherence. It gave us the room to be ourselves in front of more eyes. The campaigns were not explosions but sequences, each one tightening the vocabulary we'd chosen. Line, not spectacle, became the spine. And for days that decide things, we built frames that felt like decisions made in quiet rooms, single-breasted blazers that fell with clean gravity, a silk blouse that looked like courage, trousers that didn't need apology from their wearer or from lighting. We shot on concrete and daylight with a humility that read as confidence. The comments under the images were small essays, women noting how the jacket's shoulders sat like it understood anatomy, men admitting they wanted clothes that made them feel this calm. Our job was to make the feeling visible. Commerce took care of itself. Inside the company, momentum felt like a low, sure engine. The sample room's tiding system meant nothing got lost, including time. The archive breathed. Post-production stopped behaving like a heroic rescue and settled into rhythm. We cut SKUs, then cut them again, and the paradox asserted itself the way paradoxes do. Fewer choices made revenue rise because decision fatigue died on contact. We told the truth about what we could deliver and when. Customer service responses shortened because the product itself answered most of the questions people used to ask. The studio became the opposite of chaos, stands aligned, modifiers labeled, checklists laminated not to infantilize craft but to respect it. We let the brand's past exist as lineage, not as law. Awards don't make work better, they make it louder. But when the invitation arrived for the New York Gala, the kind of room where success becomes a mirror you have to learn to face, we accepted because our team had earned the right to sit at a table that had once been set for other names. The venue was one of those renovated train terminals with a ceiling that made everyone look smaller and more significant at once. The lighting designer understood flattering at scale. The flowers were taller than the conversations and somehow less ostentatious. The step and repeat did its job. We didn't linger there. My mother sat in the front row, straight-backed, an expression on her face I hadn't seen since childhood. Concentration without judgment. She had dressed like she always did when she wanted to be unassailable, navy sheath, pearls, hair in a softened chignon. But her hands betrayed her, fingers worrying the edge of the program until it frayed. She had spent the year in our halls learning a new grammar for value. Tonight, she would watch that grammar spoken aloud. When they called my name for Innovator of the Year, the walk to the stage felt both shorter and longer than it should have. The podium was cool under my hands. The room had the hush of a string section before a shift in key. I thanked the people who had done the work, by name because credit shapes culture. I named Ava's calendars as infrastructure and Noah's insistence on subtraction as courage. I thanked the pattern maker who fixed a sleeve head with a chalk line that changed the fate of an entire run. And when I reached the part of the speech that mattered more than the plaque, I thanked my mother, not for believing in me, but for challenging me so relentlessly that I had to build something that could survive disbelief. There was an intake of breath, a room sensing that this was not the standard gratitude. I said it anyway, that sometimes the friction that wounds you also sharpens you, and that sometimes the best proof is not the rebuttal but the work that makes rebuttals obsolete. My mother stood before anyone else did. It wasn't performative. It wasn't a plea. It was an answer. Tears tracked her cheeks without the dramatic flourish of a hand. She didn't try to wipe them. I felt the room around us widen. After backstage smelled like eucalyptus and gaffer tape. Tuxedos and gowns moved around us in controlled swirls. She found me near a catering rack and took my hand with a pressure I recognized from 1,000 small instructions across a childhood. You did what I called it. You changed with the times, she whispered. It wasn't self-pity, it was taxonomy. She was naming what had happened without decorating it. Her voice had none of the brittle edge I'd learned to guard against. I smiled because the sentence invited a correction I'd earned the right to make. No, Mom, we did. It wasn't sentimentality, it was accuracy, because change happens in plural. The engineer who rewires an archive, the cutter who refuses an almost right seam, the mother who sits in rooms built by a daughter and learns to speak in a new tense. She squeezed my hand. For once, she let silence be an approval instead of a test. Later, on the balcony above the city, the night felt like a negative we'd exposed correctly. Blacks that were black, highlights held, midtones rich enough to carry narrative. The skyline did its electric sermon. Taxes braided noise far below. Someone laughed the way you do after months of not laughing. I looked down at the plaque, pleasant weight, unimportant metal, and set it on the ledge like a prop that had served. The real award was not object but organization, a place where we're connected to worth without devouring the people making it. I thought about the first folding table, the rented lenses, the weddings where I learned how to find tenderness in chaos. I thought about the due diligence spreadsheets and the quiet audits that had more moral force than any slogan. I thought about the words I'd fed the team for months, light, line, honesty, and how they'd stopped being a mantra and started being a muscle. You can only keep such promises if you make them small and daily. The year had been nothing but small and daily. On nights like this, triumph is often mistaken for the right to forget. I refused. Memory is how you keep victory from curdling into superiority. Success wasn't about proving her wrong anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about reclaiming my story from the version that required an antagonist to make sense. The girl who had been dismissed had become the woman who could lead without reproducing the cruelty that provoked her. Leadership, I had learned, is stewardship of attention. You decide what the light touches. You decide what the frame omits. We chose to illuminate craft and omit ego, and the results told their own truth. Justice, in the end, hadn't been revenge. Revenge is a photograph of a single moment, sharp, loud, easily shared, quickly forgotten. Transformation is a sequence, quiet frames, consistent exposure, a contact sheet where you can trace the arc from intent to evidence. We had built a sequence. We had made the image resolve. The city kept its tempo. Inside, the gala pivoted to a performance. On the balcony, the air thinned into something like clarity. When my mother joined me, we didn't need to narrate the view. We stood in the hush we had both earned, and I understood that triumph isn't the sound of a crowd saying your name. It's the feel of your work speaking fluently without you, and of your heart no longer arguing with a past that can't be edited, only placed in the correct sequence and allowed to belong to its time.